Well, welcome. Good evening. Happy Juneteenth, a few days early. My name is Michael Barsanti. I'm the Edmund Wolf II Director of the Library Company. And it is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to tonight's Juneteenth celebration with Dr. Scot Brown. The Library Company is an independent research library that was founded by Benjamin Franklin and a group of his friends back in 1731. It is, we believe, the first public library and the first lending library anywhere, and was the library that supported the Continental Congresses and the Constitutional Convention, and it was the first Library of Congress. Today, we are a place for amazing scholarship. A lot of the work we do here is supporting the work of rising scholars and scholars who are going to be writing the great books they're writing sort of, I think, the next chapter of American history. I am not going to say too much more than that, except to say how much we enjoy celebrating Juneteenth. The Library Company has been celebrating Juneteenth since at least 2007. We are not new to this party. I got an email from Philip Sansky today. Phil, for many years, worked in this reading room, worked at the Library Company, and was one of our great experts in early African-American history. And he tells the story of how one of the first Juneteenth celebrations was to celebrate the publication of a book about Jane Johnson, came out in 2007. So we are very proud to be able to celebrate this holiday with you. Without any more from me, I would like to ask Professor Deirdre Cooper Owens, who is the director of our program in African American history, for at least a little while longer. Deirdre has been our director for several years now and has been a wonderful director. Among the many things she has done for us is to bring some of the great scholars of African American history to speak here at the Library Company. Dr. Brown among them. So, Deirdre, please.
Thank you very much, Mike. Welcome to our annual Juneteenth program. I am Deirdre Cooper Owens. I am the director of the program in African American history here at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And it has really been a joy to serve in this position for the last 5 years. But as I often joke, I had far too many jobs. When I started, I was just a car ride in Brooklyn to Philly, and living in Lincoln, Nebraska has proved to be, it's been a more challenging trek. But the wonderful thing I get to do, because anybody who knows me knows I can talk to anybody and make friends with lots of people. And so I know a lot of folks and they do such interesting work. And so as Mike shared, I love bringing really smart, talented, brilliant people to share their work and their expertise, their activism, their art with you. And so you'll get a combination of those things with today's speaker, Dr. Scot Brown. I'll talk a bit about him, but let me just share some information about the program in African American history. We were started in 2007, and it really has emerged as the anchor program. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that, the anchor program here. And so if you look at any book written about the early African American experience in colonial America, in what becomes the United States, you look in the acknowledgments, and almost always the Library Company of Philadelphia mentioned. And so we are very proud to be affiliated with such great scholarship. But beyond that, we also are really proud of the work that we do with emerging scholars. And so one of the ways that we try to create a pipeline program for scholars interested in, and I'm emphasizing young scholars, because many of them are at the start of their careers in undergrad, to have a pipeline program to the PhD level is with our Mellon Summer program. And so I'm going to ask them to stand up, please. And so These young people have traveled far and wide from California, from Atlanta, from North Carolina, from Nebraska. You know, I had to bring somebody to represent Lincoln. From where am I forgetting? Los Angeles, San Diego, all of these places. But Kaylin and Alejandro and Keon and Michaela and Devin are doing amazing work. They're doing archival work. And so they range from undergrad to our more senior, and I don't mean that in age, but just more senior in terms of having a master's degree, but they all have the goal of going on to a PhD program. And so it gives us great pleasure to be able to be foundational in their trek towards that. So thank you all so very much. And because this is my last year, so Mike couldn't get rid of me, I was like, I'm gonna get somebody who's not an early American. Just hold it against me, but I think y'all are gonna really enjoy it. Y'all are gonna enjoy it. It's Black Music Month. And so, you know, last year people were like, in Zoom, people welcome, and people were like, oh my God, you brought somebody in here who's painting and talking. And so this time you're gonna hear some music. And I could be selfish because I used to be Scot Brown's TA. When I was a graduate student at UCLA, he has been a dear mentor and colleague and friend of mine. And so it gives me really, really wonderful pleasure to be able to introduce him to you all so that you can also learn more about his work. And for those who are a little older, let's just say the 40 plus crowd, if you ever looked at Unsung on TV1, you'll always see, you know, Dr. Funk up in there, and that's Scot Brown. All right. So Dr. Scot Brown is an associate professor of African American Studies and History at the University of California, Los Angeles. Brown is the author of the book, Fighting for Us. So the organization Us is Maulana Karenga, and has penned numerous articles on African American history, social political movements, music, and popular culture. Dr. Brown is a contributing author and editor of the book Discourse on Africana Studies. He's also in the process of completing a book project exploring the city of Dayton, Ohio, as 1970s, the 1970s musical hotbed of soul and funk bands. He was naming to some of our students. See, I see some folk who are a little older shaking their heads. He was like, Heat Wave. He's like Roger Troutman. He was smiling at Zap. You know, he's trying to answer like this. So he was, you know, trying to tell them, and they're like, you can see someone shaking, and others are like, and then he made a reference to James and Two-Main. He's like, I used to play Juicy Fruit. We were like, you know, Biggie, you know, and they're like, oh, okay, sample that. So he's doing all of these wonderful things. It's going to be a book, and please buy it when it comes out. Brown has also appeared as an expert commentator on African American music and popular culture for many programs on television, radio, and social media. Like the National Public Radio, Sirius XM, BET, Century TV1, VH1, all of those things. And additionally, Dr. Brown has appeared in several documentaries on the civil rights and Black Power movements, including the PBS documentary, The Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution. And I truly would not be where I am without the guidance. I'm being serious, the guidance and support of mentors like Scot Brown. So it gives me immense pleasure to welcome him to our institute and to this platform. So welcome him.
Wow, thank you so much for a wonderful, inspiring, and scary introduction. This, you know, you might have raised the bar a little high for me to tiptoe and touch. But let me also thank Dr. Deirdre Cooper Owens. She's the work that she's doing with the students and the Black History Project is really a continuation of what she's always been doing. I remember her working with some community college students and saying, Professor Brown, can you come and talk to these young folks who want to, you know, they might get a PhD. And so she hasn't changed. She just has a lot more force behind her vision, and we are all the better for it. Let me also just say, thank you. Let me also just say thank you to the staff here, particularly the staff that had to put up with me and getting all this stuff together. And the jury's still out on how it's going to go, but I'll just say thank you to Allison Ronstadt, who's really gone through all the paces as far as making this happen. This is an extraordinary moment to talk about Juneteenth. I think given some of the social, political, and historical issues that are emerged in this moment, we will look back on this moment, and our discussions like these, I think, will be a matter of record for the future. Let me say that Benjamin Franklin in 1731 might not have been able to imagine a Juneteenth, right? Because at that point, he was still a slave owner himself. But in the Revolutionary period, by the end of the 18th century, he could have clearly imagined it and would have wanted it to happen. He would have wanted us to celebrate something that is celebrated all the world over in different ways with different names. That is the end of enslavement in the Atlantic slave trade. And he was a vociferous critic at a time when there were some political stakes involved in taking a position like that. So with the federal government lending official sanction to Juneteenth, Juneteenth is a day that commemorates Black liberation from slavery in the United States, celebrated on June 19th. Juneteenth has reigned as a long-standing African-American freedom celebration and sits along with a myriad of freedom celebrations. The establishment of commemorative days acknowledging the demise of enslavement, as I alluded to earlier, is not just a U.S. phenomenon. Throughout the African diaspora, the defeat of slavery has been honored in differing forms and calendar dates. In the Caribbean and Central America, North America, and South America, sometimes it's called Emancipation Day. The holiday, as we all know, as Juneteenth, was preceded by a holiday that was established in terms of the government recognition some 40 years ago, and that being MLK Day. So this question of calendar space and the way that visions of a new day, as well as points of resistance, can also find their presence in what we call the Gregorian calendar. Though much more of a recent federal holiday, as some of you may know, Juneteenth has its roots in community and in people. My first encounter with Juneteenth was at the very wise age of 12 years old. When there was I'm from Rochester, New York, by the way. I don't know if you all are familiar with that place, but we thought we were really important growing up in Rochester. We had a radio station called WDKX. It's still here to this day. It's one of the few lasting Black radio stations. It stands for Douglas, King, and X. And so there was a music festival. I confess to some of the students that I didn't always envision myself as a historian. I don't know if you're familiar with Rick James, but he was from Buffalo, and I really had aspirations to follow in his footsteps. Jury's still out. Now, when we had our festivals called the Highland Bowl Festival, it was always in the latter part of June. I only recently, in looking at articles about the establishment of the Highland Bowl Festival, noted that it was selected around that time to be really a kind of expression, embracing Juneteenth, but also embracing local talent. The Buffalo Festival was called Juneteenth. So all I knew growing up was that Juneteenth was a place, a time when bands that were better than mine performed in Buffalo. And if you wanted to see the competition, you got over to Buffalo around the time of the Juneteenth Festival. So the association of Juneteenth with music is a big part of my own personal journey as well. But why would we want to explore Juneteenth in terms of its origins, and how do these origins actually inform, and how can they help inform current discourse on notions of freedom, notions of social justice, etc.? I argue that the holiday Juneteenth offers a special opportunity to reflect on the question of what freedom and liberation mean. If I ask each of you in the room to tell me what freedom means, I doubt if we have a consensus. And that diversity in the room is also consistent with the diversity in terms of its linear diversity, that meaning change over time. There may be points and issues of consensus, but the gradations, the emphasis, notions of its possibility have changed. Obviously, the answer was truly be dynamic, layered, and always responsive to the conditions of a given period in which the question is raised. Now, the very origins of Juneteenth, I argue, present an inherent critique of official history and government pronouncement as the driving force in the granting of liberation. Once I started studying the story of Juneteenth, I heard it in ways that I think are still very important for all of us to counter. The enslaved Africans, somewhere in Galveston, didn't know they were free. They just didn't know. They were on autopilot. They just kept on laboring and toiling. But if someone could have just told them, see, just tell them, then start dancing, have a Jubilee celebration, they got Juneteenth. That's a little bit of an odd moment to celebrate. Celebrating not knowing, that's a little odd. It begs for a more deeply engaged conversation about its origin. I was taught in elementary school, like many of you, that President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st freed the slaves. Lincoln was a powerful orator, but did he actually speak freedom into existence? Wow, I've heard some great speakers. I haven't seen that one yet, but you know. In fact, a fairly reputable cable news network, who will go unnamed, re-inscribed the idea, saying that the enslaved Black folks in Southeast Texas did not, and I'm quoting literally, learn that they were free until June 19th of 1865. Actually, freedom in this story was not a pronouncement, but rather the defeat of the slaveholders themselves under the weight of the Union Army, buttressed into victory in large measure because of the swelling of its fighting ranks by Blacks who enlisted to take up arms against enslavement. We don't really think of this in the way that contextualizes it. Enslaved Africans are already, Malcolm X had responded saying, as long as it's south of the Canadian border, it's south. But even some of the Africans who made it in Canada came back, like Paul Laurence Dunbar, came back because this was a revolutionary moment in its time. One that encapsulated what freedom meant in that era, which was the overturning of slavery. Freedom was made real by the hundreds of thousands who throughout the duration of the war escaped, sabotaged the plantation system. Enslaved Africans were freed not by decree, but through struggle. Not by themselves, but struggle along with allies. But freedom was made real, not proclaimed. Why is that important? That's important because if you think about it as, well, they didn't learn they were free, it's because the pronouncement didn't mean anything. Emancipation Proclamation, whether they learned of it or not, did not disarm the enslavers in Texas. It did not change the social condition, the coercive apparatus. So that's a different concept of emancipation. And where does freedom come from? Does it come from the top by pronouncement, or does it come from those on the ground struggling for it? Juneteenth in this moment calls upon us to grapple with enslavement, in the words of historian Jeffrey Olster, as a foundational crime. He says he doesn't like that original sin, and he talks about a foundational crime along with the dispossession of Native American land as a foundational crime. When he says foundational, it's not a ghost that's haunting us. It's a foundation that, if not looked upon as such, has differing, unintended, and lasting consequences. Juneteenth in this moment calls for us to grapple with these issues. This may not seem like a revelation to many of you, but it stands as an admonition that has fueled recent attacks in the social political world. Now come back to the music and we'll deal with them. Attacks on critical race theory and a broader campaign to undo the ideological and political victories of the young people that created one of the most important recent social movements, the Black Lives Matter movement. If you want to know what people felt about the civil rights movement in its time, look at how people respond to Black Lives Matter now. It's easy to talk about Muhammad Ali now, but Muhammad Ali then was vilified. There's something that felt, he's just not patriotic. He's a problem. He's too this, he's too that. So, you know, sometimes the present is a good vessel for looking at the past. In this case, that's what I'm referring to. Juneteenth is an acknowledgement of one of the great social wonders of the world. How was it that Africans in the diaspora and the continent managed to assert a level of humanity while in the midst of such enveloping inhumanity? In 2005, I had the great fortune of interviewing Greek cultural historian named Sterling Stuckey. Those who are scholars of enslavement know who he is because he was so foundational in making the enslaved person someone to, as a person, as a cultural creator, cultural force. Summarizing the impact of enslaved people on US and world culture, this is what he said. When I look at the history of Black people in America, the major contributions came from the most oppressed, the creators of slave bards, songs, and tales. They created the greatest art in this country. Tied to that are the uses to which the intellect of slaves was put in solving some fundamentally intellectual problems in order to help their people become essentially one people. They had to grapple with this problem of coming from different parts of Africa. Some values were similar to others, and others were dissimilar. That to me was the supreme intellectual achievement of Blacks in North America, an astonishing intellectual achievement. Doesn't sound like necessarily a radical idea, but the key word being intellectual. Of course, we have great intellectuals like the founder of this library, but everyday people, the struggles of everyday people, as historians who take a more social history approach, have ways of thinking about the poor, the dispossessed, and the marginal in our society as thinkers in ways that we benefit from. Since freedom is on our minds, let me also share that the entire month of June is not uncoincidentally also Black Music Month. It's also not uncoincidentally Pride Month.
The struggle for calendar space is one that groups of in different points of society struggle with. Let me move to an important aspect of that cultural contribution that enslaved people have brought to the world, and that is music. One of the most complicated and difficult and impactful art forms that passes of human expression. If I ask you what is music, some of you will probably dismiss whole genres of music. That's not really music. So there are as many different ideas about freedom as there are what is music. Then if I ask you what is good music, then we almost have, you know, some kind of beginning of another 100-year war. So what I'd like to do is think about not just the enslaved Africans, but also think about musicians as a part of the project of defining freedom, as we use this occasion to think about what freedom means over time. But before I do that, let me give you a sense for the ebb and flow. And I asked my students this question. Oh, I'm supposed to stay put. I like to move around. Well, I apologize. I need some kind of lapel, or then I'll end up pulling that out of the cord, out of the socket. But what happens to a people who have elevated expectations around freedom and consistently over time are met with disappointing reality? Does that have an impact on their psyche? Yes, it does. And the artistic and cultural dimension of that impact is called the blues. What happens to a people, though, who consistently find triumph in unexpected places and at disconcerting times? That's called the spiritual. And I'm not talking about the blues and the spiritual as styles of music. I'm talking about them as sensibility. What happens to a people that think the whole system should be shaken up and overturned and let things start anew? Called bebop. So these sensibilities manifest themselves in different ways. If you think about the American national paradigm for how we think about the sources of freedom, that paradigm is driven by the idea that the American Constitution, in its own state, is a document that has the power for those who are in tune with its values to push this notion of freedom forward. So, yes, there are problems like enslavement. Yes, but over time, given the power of this document, given the power of the vision of its founders, freedom eventually happens. That's the notion of linear progress, tied to the bigger concept. Funny, when I was in graduate school in the 1990s, I wonder, why is my professor always talking about exceptionalism? What is he talking? Then it ends up becoming a part of the political debate. But that notion of the Constitution being a kind of a force in its own right, in pushing forward multiple ideas about freedom and contestation in its own right, is a big part of this notion of what is special about the United States. There's another school of thought that's more about social movements driven concept of the engine of freedom, and that is that people in struggle, people with their own ideas about what freedom means, struggle, contest, organize, and it's the conjunction of the two that changes this idea of freedom. But freedom for the enslaved person in the American Revolutionary period was the founding of this American democracy. It did not do it. I don't need to go into that. Freedom for those in the antebellum period must have been certainly accomplished with the overthrow of enslavement. Freedom after the Civil War turned out to be a little bit more difficult to acquire than previously imagined. And then we have, of course, the system of American apartheid, Jim Crow, the legal sanction, and social reality. Underneath that rubric, we have all kinds of moments, high expectations, great migration. We're going to a land that's promised to us, drawing from biblical notions of freedom, to find segregation even as you move north, finds its own way. Again, that new form of oppression inspires new forms of resistance, new ideas about what freedom really means. I'm just walking you through this so you can see how this thing freedom is elusive, even to this day. It's only elusive because we rethink the process of what it means as we move through these different contextual conditions. There was this thing called the double victory, the war against the fascists, war against fascism abroad, and what? Racism at home. That was a big part of the engine behind the civil rights movement, actually. So we can go on and on around this idea of elevated expectations and disappointing realities, but they also have cultural consequences. I called it the blues sensibility, the spiritual sensibility, and the bebop sensibility. And these are not exhaustive categories, and you might even think of others I can add to my analysis. So this generation has leaped into Juneteenth, fueled by the latest lunge in the pendulum swings of elevated expectations and danger-filled realities. In this new context, Juneteenth has found us through its own unpredictable, nonlinear, extraspatial, Sankofa-esque pathways. Sankofa is the symbol of a deity in the Akan faith. It's a bird that's moving forward but looking back. Think like John Coltrane's saxophone. All right? As it moves forward, it's still looking back. Listen to great artists that do something to you. Even the future sounds like something that has familiarity. And that symbol of Sankofa, return to the source, is a big part of what young people are experiencing today. Their music is also very Sankofa-esque of this generation. I had a hard time as a bass player in Rochester, New York. I had to learn how to step, play, and sing background. I still can't do it, but I tried. But it was work. Only to find out in 1979 that a group called the Sugar Hill Gang could talk in rhythmic form over the music of a group called Sheep. Good time. I couldn't fathom the idea. So if you think about those sampling over time and how the past is a part of the present and the future today, there's a sonic kind of kinship between their interest in Juneteenth, their interest in Kwanzaa, their interest in calendar space, their interest in the 60s, and the art that they're making in this present moment. But freedom is found in very interesting and unexpected places. I'm going to play a song for you that has that dimensionality to it of being modern, but also making you feel something like an enslaved, but the agony is there. And so now this is the part I have to warn you. I'm going to toggle back and forth from my Spotify playlist to the PowerPoint. So just, there's a moment This is, you know, the limitation of what I can do. So just hold tight. I'm gonna close this. Now, I want to open my Spotify Juneteenth list. All right. So I'm gonna play some freedom songs for you. Now,
Jermaine Jackson is so important to the idea of freedom if you play the bass. Because if you look at the Jackson Five, we think of them as a vocal group, but they actually were a self-contained band. Part of the movement away from the formulaic notions of R&B music as pushed by Motown was also a different formation that constituted the notion of artistic freedom, that being the self-contained band. Now, I asked my students this question. I said, well, I'm so mad there are no more Black bands. They say, yes, there is. And they tell me names of these artists that have a backup band. They have it. So there's a difference between having a band and being a band. Sly and the Family Stone, that's a band. Erykah Badu has a band. They may be called something else, but that's the difference. A self-contained band that has a different idea about the way freedom, notions of freedom, notions of spacing. The Motown model was more the lead singer, right? Backup vocals. The band, you know, that could be anybody back then. You wouldn't know who they are. Earth, Wind, and Fire, that's the band. So I found that to be something that pushed these two forces together of how freedom looks in terms of how it's staged and also what it sounds like. The city of Dayton, Ohio, that was mentioned in the introduction that I'm looking at, the premier band was a group called the Ohio Players. You all remember them? The lead singer of the Ohio Players, his name is Leroy Sugarfoot Bonner. Sugarfoot changed music just as a vocal stylist alone. Under the Motown era, you had to have the smoky like smooth falsetto. You can get a little rough like David Ruffin, but you still had to fall in some kind of way to this idea of, okay, this is where I was, okay, we're good. You had to fall into a certain idea about how an artist looked and how an artist was supposed to sound. It's very constraining. That breaking out. So if we had a quiz here, I would have asked you, okay, out of the three sensibilities, how do you classify these songs? You might have felt like Jimi Hendrix was bebop. You might have felt like, because of the lyrics and the delivery of Donny Hathaway, the spiritual side, it's aspirational. It tells you what's possible and it can happen in our day, in our time. And even if it doesn't, one day, one bright morning, when things are over, we're gonna fly away home. Now, Sugarfoot is somebody as a vocalist, and you'll hear this in a second, that actually collapses a lot of different things together. Part of what would happen with funk bands coming out of behind the 60s is they were often trying to, in a way, like Aretha Franklin did with Respect, have a kind of double meaning of the song. Not that, and in a self-conscious way, that respect would also mean respect in a relationship. Well, this is a song that is as free as it can go, but also as conventionally soulful. It's called I Want to Be Free by the Ohio Players. And there's some music happening that's odd and free and unpredictable, and you can listen to Sugarfoot's voicing. With a 9-second drum solo at the beginning, before yielding to doo-wop harmonies, followed by Sugarfoot's first line, clamoring for a day of reckoning.
one day child, one morning, when he can gather the strength to break free from the captivity, we confine ourselves to the lyric subject matter of a bad relationship. Though set in the throes of heartache, this cry for freedom easily doubled in the meaning of an unfinished struggle for Black freedom. Freedom to speak my mind all the time, to be able to make up my own mind, freedom to run away, and to be evoked by the phrases popularized in the anthem by Sam Cooke, Civil Rights Anthem. How long, by the end of the song, how long, a long time coming, which is one of the improvisational lines he says. And by the end of I Want to Be Free, we are rooting for Sugarfoot, who is uncertain about the exact timing of the inevitable triumph. He says, I'm going to be all right after a while, but ever faithful that he'll get there. He says, I think the Lord done gave me the strength now. I want to be free. So live music was much more dominant in these kinds of meditations on freedom. And if you go back to the origins of Juneteenth, you can't separate music and the bodily arts from its arrival. The original name of Juneteenth was Jubilee. What do people say was taking place when, how did that react? And let's not think of this as staging, but let's think of this in an interactive form. They said that, they sung and they danced. They sung songs that captured all three of the sensibilities. Some of them were also fearful of what was to come. What did this really mean to have an entire edifice now caving in? What do we expect? What support will we get? Incredibly so, as a testimony to the cultural cohesiveness of enslaved Africans. The majority spent their time looking for family members, wandering sometimes hundreds of miles to find and try to utilize that moment to bring their loved one within their touch and reach and to start a new life. So live music was much more dominant, especially in historical dances. You know, the big leap that we see in the way that music is experienced is called the phonograph effect. I used to get mad about sampling. Yeah, I used to get mad about they're using synthesizers. They should be using the real bass. I used to get mad because they're not playing horns anymore. It's not real music, I said. But the phonograph effect is that break from when music is not experienced in its live moment. So if you're talking 19th century, Juneteenth, those songs were songs that people sung. Others have written and written about what it felt like to hear them. But that music was created in a life experience, and if you weren't there, you didn't get it. The phonograph effect is that break where you can take music out of its social context and experience it on a phonograph, on the radio, on a cassette tape, whether it's sampled or not. That's the real break. And it's no accident then that the dances that people saw were also very much connected to those early Juneteenth celebrations. Even the term juking comes out of the Black Gullah dialect, meaning disorderly, which is why you have the juke joint. What else you got? You want to hear some music? Put your quarter in it. Juke box. There you go. Not just in Georgia and South Carolina. In the 1930s, jukeboxes grew to become a fixture in bars, taverns, restaurants. During the World War II era, the French were experimenting with public spaces for dancing. They combined the word disc with the term, that's the name of this institution, which is what? This place is not a disco. Now, I know you want to dance, but I haven't turned it into a disco yet. It's a library, meaning it's a bibliothèque. So you put disco and bibliothèque, you got the discotheque. I'm not making this up, man. You can read Alice Echols' book on disco. I wish I could make this up. I wouldn't have to do these kind of lectures or anything or teach at any institution. These record libraries of wartime Paris served drinks along with playing a variety of jazz sounds. Again, coming back to the freedom theme, discotheques were spaces that were a form of resistance, especially during beaching friends. Jazz was seen as subversive. And remember I talked about jazz with the bebop sensibility being that notion of overturning something. Somewhere in the responses of officialdom, somebody got that memo and would render these kinds of gatherings places that people would have to do underground. While the term discotheque did not gain popular currency until the 1970s here in the United States, its association in the language of describing spaces that function as late-night interactions with dance and drink were firmly in place in large metropolitan centers long before the 70s. In 1964 in Los Angeles, the club Whiskey A Go-Go opened and was described by an Entertainment Weekly as part discotheque and hip hangout. Discos were indeed part of what we have termed loosely as part of the underground. Like the underground that artist Jimi Hendrix flourished in before venturing to England. The disco underground was linked even in ways that mirrored the underground way that socially socially unacceptable could occur, was linked closely with the gay community, for the most part in popular discourse, the gay male community, rather than the lesbian and more recently, more mindful transgender community. But in 1976, a Newsweek article purported to have exposed this large unknown trend, stated that the group most responsible for keeping discos alive was the homosexual community, with an interviewee saying the pioneering done in the disco field has been done by gays, with Blacks and Puerto Ricans following. The common denominator here is oppression. Though a bit simplified, this account does convey the trend in New York discotheques. And then the word disco would even broaden in its way that it's embraced. So in the Black area in one of the Black areas in my hometown, Zips was a club that was open till 4 in the morning rather than just 2. And it was called Zips Disco Jazz Cafe. So there are ways that the disco loses its underground specificity, but while it's underground, the music, the soundtrack of this underground space, these underground spaces, was African-American music, primarily African-American music. It created a new hero of sound. Remember I talked about the phonograph effect? Who was the hero in the disco? The DJ. So you know I got mad about that. Now, it's no accident that here in Philadelphia, the sound that really is the architecture of the disco sound, which is really Good Feelings
We call it good feelings because we associate certain characteristics with feeling good. And I'll show you how powerful that experiment is. Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, songwriters here, and they ran a record label called Philadelphia International. They were the Motown of the early 70s right here in Philadelphia. But they also were coming from other traditions themselves as artists. Came out of jazz, came out of the church. But they found ways to capture the sensibilities that I spoke of in ways that would confuse the listener. All right. I'd like you to listen to the words of this song, and you tell me, that's the lyrics now. What is the sensibility? Blues, bebop, or spirituals? Don't look at the, close your eyes, don't look at the title. That is a sonic experiment of epic proportion. Scientists wish they could do this to this day. The lyrics are blues lyrics. I mean, it's almost a suicide letter. But the sonic messaging and the instrumentation is telling you something different. The pace, 4 on the floor. That was a prerequisite in this track. The use of certain kind of chords. We tend to think about major chords as happy chords. We tend to think about certain keys like C, a happy key. Now, I don't think that's universal. That's culturally constructed, but it still speaks to that. To this day, music does those kinds of things. But what is so incredible about that experiment is its contradiction, right? That the musical, the instrumental arrangement is so powerful in saying what you should feel and telling you how you should feel. You can say the most, sad blues lyrics you want, and you will not hear it. All right? I'm not gonna play this one, but I'm gonna give you a homework assignment. Listen to Candy Staton, Young Hearts Run Free. And you're gonna have the same conclusion. So I want to end with dealing with this moment. I want to end with the notion of freedom. My own belief is that you cannot have freedom without truth telling. Freedom and truth go hand in hand together. If you're not dealing with truth, you may think you're free, but whatever this thing called freedom is has to be aligned with truth. For many decades, the term woke, or the act of waking up, has signified the idea of social and political awareness. Recently, wokeness has emerged in American political debate, with its critics using the term to vilify educational attempts for an inclusive historical lens. There's even you may have heard about this, a Stop Woke Act. That's the official name of the law. Signed into law in 2022, essentially prohibiting instructions on race or diversity that imply a person's status, or they say as oppressed or privileged. It bans that if it's based on race, origin, a national origin, or sex. The backlash to that concept is what I call historical gaslighting. Historical gaslighting is grounded in the rhetorical realm of personal gaslighting, using the tactic of accusing others of the very actions that one is undertaking. I'm in an organized crime family, I call you the organized crime. I am stealing from you, I call you the thief. And if you repeat it enough, at the very least, you've got confusion. Right? Sound familiar? Okay, all right. I want to be above all this. Those who champion historical accuracy away from erasure, revisionism, and official fabrication, marginalization, are cast as initiators of a social problem rather than proposing solutions. And so what I'd like to do is think about the way Black music can get us to thinking about this question of wokeness, and also truth-telling. Now, I was interested in how did this term come about? And it looks like we have artists very much involved. One artist is Erykah Badu. Erykah Badu had a song called Master Teacher. Now, when she came out with that song, it was right around the time that a group of women artists who were contesting the Putin regime's treatment of the LGBT community. I'm blanking on their names, but I know it was, something provocative. Pussycat? Pussy Riot. Pussycat Riot. Okay, I don't know the word, but it's okay. I don't know. I'm not using this as an opportunity to act bad. So, but the point is that Erykah Badu took note. She's a strong activist for artistic expression and political freedom. Freedom, what does she do? She tweets about that group and says, "Stay woke," which is how it circulated in that iteration. But it wasn't the first iteration of woke from an artist speaking to a political scenario. And let me just do this little bit here. Hold on, let me back up. This is a song by Cuddy William Ledbetter, also known as Leadbelly. In the 1930s, he wrote a song called the Scottsboro Boys. Go to Alabama, you better watch out, landlord get you, gonna jump and shout Scottsboro Boys, tell you what it's all about. Now, at the end of this recording, he has an interview explaining and listen to his conversation about it. So I'm gonna forward the song and you have to listen to it later on. This is in the 1930s.
But stay woke, keep your eyes open.
Stay woke, keep your eyes open. So the notion of consciousness in a world that, in my point of view, turns the truth upside down. The very idea of being conscious, Malcolm X would say, wake up, clean up, and stand up. Or if we go to back to the Philly international tradition that I'd like to close out with, I think the messaging here and what it speaks to in this freedom discussion lingers with us to this very day. And as we reflect on this, just gonna let's listen to it and then we'll close on out. So Juneteenth informs us and reminds us once again that freedom itself is ever changing and it's an unfinished project. It's much better to be woke and awake than it is to be asleep to that very, very important reality that shapes our daily lives, even to this very day. Thank you all.
So we have time for just a few questions, maybe 3 or 4. And I'm going to pass the mic over to our wonderful member event specialist.
Really quick, thank you. Just a few things. The Philadelphia International, their headquarters was right here at Broad Spruce, where the new building is at. So they're supposed to put a museum and eventually, I don't know if ever it's going to happen, but I wanted to mention that for everybody. But also the idea of woke, with that song, Master Teacher, there's a great interest in Buddhism today. And the Buddha was the awakened one. So there's that context also might take that kind of a twist to it. So I just thought I'd bring out those two little things. Thank you.
Very important point. The term that was used in African-American political circles was conscious or consciousness. And I had a debate with a friend of mine. He said, I never called myself woke. I'm not with that. I said, do you really think if they switched it to consciousness, that the difference would it mean anything? They vilify consciousness. So anyway, the point is that there is a vocabulary to backlash. And that vocabulary is just as dynamic as those who are creating new modes to resist and new conceptions of freedom.
This was really good. Thank you so much for coming to Philadelphia. I was thinking of the film from 1959, The Cry of Jazz, and how it talks about the origins of jazz, the impact of Black music on all forms of music in the country. And it was very interesting. So this reminds me of that film, because we're talking about music and the impact and the influences of Africans. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. Like, I was sitting here thinking of that film, like we're having a dialogue discussion in that form.
I think it's a very, you're spot on, and I'm inspired. Now I got to go back and look at that again. I think I've passed through it, but I didn't really look at it, but that's really important. By Sun Ra. Sun Ra said the world is in chaos because musicians have to work for money, and music is either your personal ambassador or personal nemesis that goes right to the universe. And if musicians are pushed by driving money, then that connection is cut off from humanity. Sounded like he was a little way out, but I wonder.
Thank you for this. The question I have really is sort of maybe trying to bridge sort of what I would think of as narratives, right? Musical narratives versus maybe literary narratives. Because one of the things that you brought up that's so fundamental, that occurs at least so often in blues music, is this sort of contradiction, right? Music that might be very upbeat, very sort of like happy feeling, but lyrics that are often very dark, and this sort of very fundamental contradiction, right? That in many ways runs against sort of the sentimental narratives that we often get very comfortable with when we talk about things like Juneteenth, when we talk about things like African-American history, certainly when we talk about things like American history. We don't like to embrace the complexity of it, right? And so one of the things that's sort of almost embedded when we talk about music in this way is its sort of ability to sort of navigate outside of these sort of, you could say, a sentimental lane versus a tragic lane, and to maybe create a different type of experience where the narrative doesn't have to fit into one or the other. And I guess I'm kind of wondering if there's a way you might be able to describe sort of what is happening in Black music in this way that embraces these kind of contradictions, that embraces this really competing sort of sense of emotion, right? That, is there a way that you can imagine translating that sort of into the historical stories that we tell about, who we are?
Yeah, I think in historical discussions of culture, we think about it as a sacred and a profane sometimes, right? So those folks who can go to church, who can go to the juke joint on Saturday night and go to church, right? And be involved in similar forms of cultural expression, bodily movement, giving up the funk, giving it up, right? Giving to the Lord, give it up. So just a sense of being open to where the vibration takes you. I think the sentimentality can occur with any of these different movements, but makes a blues, that was a hybrid in the song Bad Luck. It was lyrically blues, but musically spiritual and uplifting. Now, the blues that makes you cry is the blues where there's symmetry between the lyrics, like the song by Prince called Old Friends for Sale. Get them while you can, it's hot. Watch out, they'll kiss you and tell you and show you the friends that they're not. So, and it's that it's like almost like a dirge, funeral dirge kind of feeling. Or the song by the Ohio Players that will scare you called Our Love Has Died. And the lyrics just, that is what makes that side of it. But part of, I think, its relationship to African-American culture is it's okay to cry that out. It's okay to feel that. There's no, certain types of masculinities in African-American culture are progressive masculinities in the sense that even when you listen to like Ruffin or someone scream, they could be crying, they could be shouting. All of those types of expressions, I think, are part of the range of expression. What's happening with African-American music now, I think, is much more about the economics of it and whether or not the same kinds of choices that can give you a George Clinton, that can give you a Roberta Flack, right? That can give you a Minnie Riperton, right alongside the Brothers Johnson, if there is the kind of economic architecture for those kind of choices. And I think they exist. I'm not an atavist at all. I think they exist. It's just that it's in different modes, you know, on the internet, personalized. But what I think is missing is we don't have as many collective experiences like the concert, right? Where thousands of people are experiencing something together because we have a much more curated, individualized engagement with music in many cases. I saw something really bizarre on campus that we had. It was a silent disco. People had their headphones in. I said, wow, man, is that what craziness looks like? So but the point is that that generation did not have a problem with that. So, you know, with the exception of line dancing, I think line dancing is people's search for something akin to a collective moment with music and the body. But I know we're running out of time.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
It's more of a statement within the question, but it, you know, prior to the MTV revolution is within the vinyl, the album, of how the album cover was the expression along with the music and the lyrics came along with the album. And that was, you know, our generation being able not only to, you know, sometimes you see the album and want to buy it before you even heard the music, just based on what the album looked like, you know, especially Honey.
Yeah, she's talking about the Players album.
Yeah.
Were pretty explicit. My grandmother didn't like me getting those albums for Christmas. My aunt was like, he just listens to the music. He's not going to look at the album, but I did. But the point is also that, yes, the visual experience, but there's two dimensions to it. There was the concert, which was a visual experience. The mothership actually landed, right? Right in the P-Funk tour. So the concert was visual and the album covers were visual, but the album covers also were another facet of creativity. Reading the cartoon work or some of the really daring photography that's going on. That's its own sort of art form. I remember the Ohio Player, the leader of the group called Satch, would always have these quasi-philosophical statements that he probably thought were deeper than they actually were. But, you know, you see, do you really see? You know, I see. That's just an example. I don't want to get anybody. But anyway, that's the kind of experience, the sort of journey, and all the work you had to do as a creative yourself in engaging it. So it was a lot. But you're sitting down with an album cover and there's all these things. You are working just like the art is working. You're meeting somewhere in that dialogue with it that is not always the case with video. I think that, so that's a question, but then there are really creative artists that do things like Missy Elliott, what she would do with video to really push your sense of what makes sense in a linear lived world, right? So there's lots of possibilities. It's really the spirit of creativity, the spirit of creative resistance that I think is the glue that binds all of these things together across generations and across modes of technological delivery.